in Darlington. I'd first of all like to thank Chief Constable Joe Farrell and members of a senior leadership team for joining me today to participate in this public accountability meeting. The focus of this meeting will be safer business crime. Safer business is a priority area in the Police and Crime Commissioner, that's Joy Allen, Police and Crime Plan, in which he has pledged to increase understanding of crime, threats and abuse faced by business and shop workers, and to deliver the help that they deserve. The Commissioner has welcomed the progress being made to support and protect shop workers and retail staff from crime and abuse across County Durham and Darlington. She has overseen a series of improvements to toughen the approach to retail crime and abuse to ensure the business community feels supported and listened to. Over the past year, the Commissioner has ensured support is offered to all shop workers who become victims of crime through her victim care and advice service. During this period, 15 people have been supported, ranging from shop workers assaulted by shoplifters through to those impacted during a violent knife point robbery. The Commissioner has supported the rollout and development of shop and retail watch schemes and supportive partnerships that aim to address business and retail crime. This includes shoplifting, and quarterly meetings are held with the National Federation of Independent Retailers for an ongoing insight into the problems faced by the retail and business community. The Commissioner has also linked with her Victims Champion to monitor the rollout of the new Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, which has made abuse against shop workers an aggravated offence and introduced tougher punishments for offenders. This involves ensuring victims of business crime have their voices heard through the feedback communicated to the Victims Champion and consistency of approach to victim and business impact statements. Nationally, a new crime survey by the British Retail Consortium has revealed a huge rise in the number of incidents against retail workers, with 1,300 reported every day between April 2020 and March 2021, almost treble the 445 per day reported in the previous year. The British Retail Consortium is increasingly concerned about reports of rising levels of violence, abuse and antisocial behaviour linked to tackling shoplifting, an issue Commissioner Allen has already worked hard to address. The Retail Consortium has written a letter to politicians and police and crime commissioners about the issue, which has won the backing of more than 100 leaders across England and Wales. Commissioner Allen has welcomed its recommendations for improvement, which are already being addressed as part of her own police and crime plan priorities. Commissioner Allen is fully supportive of the British Retail Consortium and the work of other campaigns such as the Co-op's Respect for Shop Workers initiative and Union of Shop Distributed and Allied Workers Union, which is USDOR, in raising this important issue. The clear message is that abuse or violence of any kind against our retail workers will not be tolerated, and this issue will be taken extremely seriously. One of the ways we are supporting business is to make it easier for staff to report incidents online via the Force's Sentry Sys system, which allows business to upload evidence such as CCTV and statements directly at the time convenient to them. In addition to making the process for reporting easier, the system aims to increase confidence among shop workers that their safety is of paramount concern. The Commissioner herself has personally visited many towns and villages to meet business owners and hear firsthand their experience of business crime and antisocial behaviour. Progress is clearly being made, but there is much more to do, and we will continue to scrutinise the constabulary's work and review our own approach to ensure that we're doing everything possible to protect retail workers and businesses from crime and abuse. During the past year, 644 business incidents were directly uploaded to the Sentry system, and the Commissioner continues to monitor its use to increase coverage and take-up. Over the last few weeks, the Commissioner has given her ongoing commitment to being open and transparent in conducting her duties, and has given residents and businesses of County Durham and Darlington the opportunity to put forward any questions and comments around safe business. Our office has also linked with the National Federation of Independent Retailers, the National Business Crime Solutions Initiative, and the North East Retail Partnership to gauge their take on violence and abuse against shop workers, experience of their members, scale of the problem, and local solutions, with a view to providing a clear understanding of the picture locally and regionally. A full recording of this meeting, including all questions and answers, will be uploaded onto YouTube after this meeting and made available to the public. This recorded meeting will enable residents and local businesses to see how the accountability process works and the role the Commissioner plays in delivering an efficient and effective police service by scrutinising the performance of the force and ensuring it is responsive to the needs of the residents and local businesses of County Durham and Darlington. I want to take this opportunity to thank everybody who submitted questions around this subject, for all those who provide a name and address with a question. I will ensure that my office provides you with a personal response on the Commissioner's behalf. It may be useful for me to talk through the format and who is in attendance today at this accountability meeting. In a few minutes, I will invite Chief Constable Joe Farrell to say a few words and provide some operational context and background information around this subject. There will be a half-hour presentation delivered by Chief Inspector Neil Bickford and Detective Chief Inspector Chris Barker. Following this presentation, I will read out a statement of questions that have been sent to our office and will direct them to the Chief Constable and her team to provide responses. This meeting will be expected to last no longer than 90 minutes, and that will be down to me. And I do hope that members of the public will find the content of this presentation useful to assist them in having a better understanding about how I will continue to hold the force to account to address local policing issues and to ensure Durham Constabulary is an efficient and effective police force. I will now hand over to Chief Constable Joe Farrell to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm joined today by Deputy Chief Constable Kieran Irvin and Mrs. Sheena Irwin, Head of our Governance and Insights Command. So just to provide some additional context to the presentation you're going to hear, while we talk about business crime and safer business, it's quite a broad church, and the presentation today is going to give some insight into the range of engagement and work that we're involved in across a variety of businesses. So we're going to talk about commercial burglary, and what I mean by that is where commercial premises, business premises are subject of crime and burglary, and we'll go into some detail as to our successes in that area. We're going to talk about the impact of organised crime against business. Moving on to issues around licensed premises and antisocial behaviour that affects businesses in our area, and then moving through to things like Shop Watch, where we try and raise awareness and build up networks of people who can be our eyes and ears and help us. And as the Deputy Commissioner talked about there, we'll touch on the use of technology, our centralist system, which enables us to work more efficiently with businesses and ensure that we provide a good and comprehensive service and capture evidence that supports our activity. So I'm going to pass on now to Chief Inspector Neil Bickford and DCI Chris Barker, who are going to provide not only some details around the types of crime that affect business, but also our performance in this area, and acknowledging from my part that we have a clear part to play in ensuring the economic prosperity of our area, and our response to business crime is key in that people can prosper and their businesses are sustainable. So I'll pass over to the two Chief Inspectors now. Thank you.
Morning, thank you. I'll start. DCI Chris Barker. I am responsible for the crime teams working in the south locality of Durham. And one of my thematic responsibilities is around our response to business burglaries, or commercial burglaries as they're often known. Hopefully, between Chief Inspector Bickford and I, we'll be able to demonstrate that there really is a joined up approach to dealing with all kinds of business crime across the force, and give a true reflection of all the efforts that go on from all of our teams. We have prepared a PowerPoint presentation. I don't know whether it's possible for that to be shared. Fantastic, thank you very much. So if we can slash that, brilliant. So move on to our introductory slide. As Chief Constable Farrell's alluded to there, we'll talk through some of the issues that we face in our performance figures, and then we'll go into a little bit of a description around what is classed as commercial burglary, the challenges that we're facing in that, and how as a force we tackle those. So County Durham's rate for commercial burglaries sits currently at 1,507 per 100,000 population with the England and Wales area, but the national average being 1,301 per 100,000 population, which is clearly above that average and puts us at the 9th highest figure in the England and Wales area. Which obviously isn't quite where we aspire to be. We obviously aspire to be farther down that list in relation to those numbers, but we'll talk through some of the progress that's being made. But interestingly, I think we sit at 10th highest in the nation for other burglaries, so residential burglaries. So it may be that we have and live in an area with a population where burglary is more prevalent than in certain others, which is again something that we're looking to work towards. And one of the biggest success stories we have with that is that our resolved rate for commercial burglary in Durham is the highest in the UK. It's something that we've talked about for some time, and we have regularly been sitting in around that area. And our current resolved rate for commercial burglaries set at 22.2%. So a national average of 8.9% resolved rate demonstrates that although we are having a slightly higher proportion of those crimes than what would be in other areas, punching well above our weight in relation to getting those crimes resolved. So over 1 in 5 is a sanctioned outcome at the end of. But those are year-to-date figures, and the data is collated nationally, not necessarily updated as quickly as we'd like. So the data that has started out quoting are from May of this year, yet we have seen a reduction in commercial burglaries for the June and July period when compared to the previous months. So we are hopeful that we will see improvements on that performance, and that we are, through some of the work that we're doing, making the right inroads to dealing with the challenges that we face. Move on to the next slide for me. So a bit of an explanation of what commercial burglary is. So commercial burglaries can come across all kinds of businesses set across our communities. Very often we look at rural areas, farm burglaries, outbuildings, sheds, garages. But then at the same time, in our urban areas, we can look at thefts from shops when they're closed during hours of darkness as a burglary would be understood by most, but they also include theft of goods from stores during business hours by people entering into areas of those buildings to which they should not ordinarily have access. So going behind a till, going into a storeroom, all of these things would class as a commercial burglary and would count against those figures. So as Neil and I go on, we'll talk about how both the Crime Command and the local policing command work together to try and deal with those. So we recognise in our force area that there are lots of different profiles of offender committing these very different and far-ranging crimes. We are aware that within the locality we have organised criminal groups that will go and target certain areas, either with repeated burglaries at stores or areas in our town centres and retail parks, or occasionally in more rural areas. Often the challenges of these burglaries are that they take place during the hours of darkness. Often in rural areas there is less coverage around the traditional crime fighting techniques that we use around CCTV, ANPR cameras. So there is often a lot more work to do to try and understand how we can identify those people committing these offences and how we can take sanction against them. Clearly in town centres there are often more opportunities for investigations to get us started and lead us towards those responsible. So in order to combat that, we work very closely with our local policing colleagues and the communities to try and understand and help get the communities to help us to tackle these criminals and to prevent crime. So we have across the Durham area some quite successful business watch and farm watch practices that have already been discussed in the introduction there. So we are very much alive to a big range, and we are also very much alive to the fact that acquisitive crime in general, due to the current cost of living crises and current problems that are going on economically, are expected to increase. As people are driven further towards poverty, they will invariably, or many will look towards criminality to get by, whereas they might not necessarily have done so. And there are, as we'll discuss in a moment, other types of offending that have come off the back of some global and economic issues that present opportunities to organised criminals that we must now look to combat. So if we move on to the next page, we'll talk about how we deal with the challenges that we face around commercial burglaries. So currently our performance is strong, and that's driven largely through teamwork across the local and policing and the crime teams in each of our 4 locality areas. So each day, every burglary offence is reviewed by a detective supervisor, and they will be brought and presented to one of our local daily leadership meetings, chaired jointly by the local chief inspector and the local detective chief inspector, where we will discuss that we have given a proportionate response initially to each crime, that we have methods in place to identify and pursue all proportionate lines of inquiry, that wherever there's a series of crimes that has taken place, our intelligence department will assist in identifying that series and help us to move towards understanding who it may be that's committing those crimes. And then we look to prioritise the arrest of those identified, specifically around those repeat offenders, prolific offenders that we all are aware of, and often looking to make sure that we make those early arrests, gain the best possible evidence and prevent future offending. And then whenever we have made those arrests, look to take the swiftest and most proportionate result and outcome as we can, very often using deferral schemes and things like taking offences into consideration for those repeat suspects to try and make sure that we identify and give the best possible service to each of those victims and get as swift a justice as we possibly can. We also work closely with other forces. Operation Hawkeye is something that is linked across all of the regional forces to cover our rural areas. Now, I know it's supported by the PCC's office and actively tackles through our intelligence systems and those of our local partners to understand who is moving across borders, either coming in or out of our area to go and commit crime, and either taking stolen items in or out of our force area to go and reap the rewards of their endeavours. More locally, through those daily leadership meetings, every locality runs Operation Trident. Now, Operation Trident is something that we use to tackle all manner of neighbourhood crime. Commercial burglary doesn't necessarily sit with that banner, but does come into our Operation Trident profiles, where we will identify target areas and target individuals who we believe to be out and about actively committing crime. Those people will be given out as briefings to uniformed officers and CID teams every day and every evening, so that wherever possible we'll deploy our resources into the areas where we believe those offenders are most likely to be offending, and to actively target those people to prevent them from offending, and if possible catch them in the act. And as a result, we have had contact from the neighbourhood crime unit within the Home Office. We've gone into Superintendent Lee Gosling, asking for him to provide an update similar to what we've just discussed around how Durham's approach works and why we have been so successful in tackling crime and coming up with the resolve rates that we're currently demonstrating. To give some examples of what we are doing and how we've had some recent success, the next slide talks to us about some figures and statistics. If we can move on one. There we go, thank you. So for offences committed in 2022, we've used a variety of sanctions to demonstrate that we will take every opportunity we can to progress these crimes. So 61 of our crimes have had one or more suspects charged to court in relation to a commercial burglary. 4 adults have been cautioned outside of the court process, and 1 youth has been so. 4 crimes have been dealt with by way of community resolution, and 5 have been dealt with by way of a diversionary scheme, Operation Checkpoint, to make sure that we are actually tackling reoffending and preventing further crime with an educational message, as well as we are going through the punitive court sanctions. And we've put on here a couple of good examples where we've done lots of work to try and deal with offenders. So the first on there is an organised crime group principal member. So the head of an organised crime group has been identified as committing a farm burglary in our area. This individual lives in County Durham and has offended both in our locality and away across the nation for some significant period of time. Strong investigation and response has managed to identify and gather the evidence to prove that this gentleman has been responsible for that crime. So with the circulation of him on the police national computer, we knew that he was out travelling around the country committing further crimes, which has led to him being stopped in his vehicle in the Cambridgeshire area, and as a result arrested for our offence in South Durham, brought back here, and he's since been charged, remanded into custody, and has now been found guilty and convicted, sentenced to 20 months in jail to prevent his offending and that, hopefully, of the wider group in which he operates. But a really significant offender, travelling and causing lots of harm to rural communities, both here and further afield. So a really good story. And the other is from the east locality, the Peterlee area, where the locality policing teams have recognised that there's been a series of crimes in there around short retail stores when they've been closed on an evening. I think there's some retail stores and some public houses. And through all those investigations, lots of work being done. They've identified a crime series and managed to put some work around forensics and other investigative techniques to understand that a male who hadn't been previously committing offences, he had offended many years ago, wasn't currently known to a lot of our local officers, but through this investigation identified that he had been responsible for one offence for which he was charged and 8 other similar offences that were taken into consideration, and he's also awaiting a sentence to prevent his offending, and that's arrested the crime series that was going on in and around the Peterlee locality. So some really positive work in relation to that. At the start of the presentation, Mrs. Farrell talked around how we were also looking at other organised criminality, and I mentioned the emergence of a new crime trend, which is this one, which is deemed as Operation Crystal. So we in Durham have come up with a response to a nationally emerging trend of theft of cooking oil. It's identified through Operation Opal, through the serious and organised crime meetings, and brought into our force area. And this has arisen because since the war in Ukraine, cooking oil value has gone through the roof, and it has now become a precious commodity due to the ability to turn cooking oil into biodiesel. As I drove into work this morning, I noticed a McDonald's truck. They advertised the fact on the back that they now turn all of their cooking oil into biodiesel. In doing so, companies such as Aleco, that's mentioned on there, can create cooking oil valued at 40 pence a litre, convert it to biodiesel and resell it at £1.40 per litre, which gives biodiesel a value of £600 to £700 per metric tonne. So it is a valuable commodity that is quite easily stolen, quite easily taken from a truck. Again, in hours of darkness, often you'll have these lorries will be parked up in laybys, or they'll be taken from fast food trucks and taken in vast quantities and driven away. But due to the nature of the oil and its uniformness, there's nothing unique about it. If you take oil from one barrel, it's identical to the next. So it's really challenging for us to understand where some oils come from if we don't catch the offenders in the act. So it's really important that as policing nationally, we build up a strong picture and understand who's involved in this crime. And we think, but the latest count is at least 180 individuals using somewhere in the region of 100 different vehicles moving around the country committing crimes of this nature. The majority of it is born out of Western European crime groups operating from the southeast of England, where there is knowledge that there are processing plants that are being used to process this cooking oil into biodiesel. And very often the method is for these people to travel around in unmarked vans, trucks, but wearing and carrying identity as if they are an Aleco oil worker. So really organised and really well planned. So locally, if we move on, we talk to how that has impacted on our area. So to date, we've identified 12 offences that have taken place between March and June across Darlington, Chesterley Street, Crooks, Spennymoor and Durham City, which has led to us having to have a response and deal with this quite quickly. So we have identified a SPOC in each area. So within each of the crime teams, there is a volume crime team led by a detective sergeant. Each of those detective sergeants is linked into a Microsoft Teams channel so that they are aware of any of these offences that occur in our area. They quickly share intelligence amongst themselves and out through our intelligence unit into other regional partners. And whenever there are suspect vehicles that come into our area, we get alerted. And whenever we have any suspect activity and identify any new vehicles, we feed that back into the national group and we can tackle it as quickly as possible. To make sure that we do maximise our effectiveness, we have a plan in place such that whenever these offences take place, we are prioritising our response to identify and intercept those vehicles. The best chance we have is to catch them with the oil in the process and to take CCTV and any other evidence as quickly as we possibly can. So to that end, we have had some local success. There's been success through a gentleman charged for a series of oil thefts in the Barnard Castle area. On another occasion, a 42-year-old from North Yorkshire has been arrested after a rural community members have alerted us to his suspicious activity, and then we've been able to track down a vehicle and link others to that. And as a result, we've managed to charge him and others in correlation with other forces for a series of crimes, including our own, and he has since appeared at Suffolk Magistrates Court on the 6th of September and will be convicted of those offences. So a really positive piece of work that is something new to our area, but just hopefully demonstrates to you all that we are ready and able to react to any crimes that come in relation to our business community, wherever they are across our policing area. I'll now pass across to Chief Inspector Neil Bickford, who will talk in some detail around how the local policing teams are focused in and around similar endeavours, but from a slightly different perspective. Neil, if you want to take over from there.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So Chris has given an overview of commercial burglaries and our investigative approach to tackling them. I'd like to talk a bit more about business crime more widely and the work that the local policing command do in tackling the same. So I'll go through each locality and I'll give some broad highlights, and I'll then discuss the upcoming week, National Week of Action, and I'll conclude with some thoughts on violence against retail workers. So starting with the West locality, this would include areas covered by Concert, Stanley, Chester Street. The first thing I'd like to highlight is that throughout the whole force area, the neighbourhood police teams routinely conduct preventative and problem-solving activity with local businesses. And an excellent example of this partnership work is the new McDonald's in Stanley. So in this example, even before a spade was put in the ground, representatives from our neighbourhood police team started dialogues with the franchisees, and we discussed the issues around youth ASB, which was prevalent in Stanley, where the restaurant was to be located. Forgive me for those that know this already, the new McDonald's is right in the centre of the town in an area that had already experienced raised levels of ASB, given its proximity to the bus station and the front street and the shops and the supermarkets. So early discussions were had, discussions centred around having security staff and what security staff we might employ. And a very early wise decision was having a sort of maternal type security guard as opposed to your stereotype who the kids like to wind up and run after, and that really sort of paid dividends. That was followed up by our local police teams visiting secondary schools and advising the schools and the pupils of the new restaurants, and talking about it in positive tones, but warning of consequences of poor behaviour and the potential for being barred. You will not believe the leverage that you can have over a teenager of a lifetime ban from McDonald's. It really, really was impactful, a big deterrent. So once that McDonald's was opened, the police and the franchisees and the management team, they would meet on a monthly basis to discuss incidents over the preceding month, and arrangements were put in place whereby anyone who had been barred from McDonald's for antisocial behaviour around the area were issued with a banning letter. That was followed up by acceptable behaviour contracts from our policing teams, all on body-worn video. And the consequence of this early preventative and planning action was that after an initially really small number of incidents, once McDonald's was opened, the numbers just disappeared completely, and to the extent where, given the size of the premise, the calls to service are virtually negligible. A good example of an investigative success on the west is Batley's. Again, Batley's is a large cash and carry in Chester Street. It was recently subjected to a £100,000 theft of cigarettes. DNA was left at the scene, but by good proactive stops from our response teams, we managed to identify some offenders who were cross-border offenders. Subsequently investigated by Concert CID, resulted in a full admission to burglary, and the offender was subsequently remanded in custody. You'll have heard me talk in previous executive boards and accountability meetings about the nighttime economy, and particularly the nighttime economy work in Concert. The nighttime economy, as we know, is unfortunately synonymous with illegal activities such as money laundering, the use of illegal workers, counterfeit products and violence. And this really harms legitimate businesses who try and run responsible operations. So for a short while, there was a particular acute spike, particularly in the west of the county, due to the infiltration of various organised crime groups. And our local policing teams, together with partners in the council, together with our alcohol licensing team, did really targeted and robust inspections of premises, resulting in a number of licenses been revoked and premises closed permanently, and a number of bars with really stringent restrictions placed on them. Now, I'm really cognizant here of the audience and the subject matter. So what I want to highlight is we will always work with responsible retailers. But when we're talking about this robust, no nonsense approach in the nighttime economy, this is policing criminals who are trying to infiltrate legitimate businesses for nefarious purposes at the expense of legitimate entrepreneurs and the legitimate business community. The next slide, please. So much of the focus, as I've said, is about planning and prevention and basically being in tune with what's going on in our local communities. As you'll be aware, on the East Coast, there's an awful lot of business and retail development, particularly around Seaham, around Church Street and the seafront. We've seen pop-up cafes, bars, restaurants, and much of the partnership work here is focused around prevention and the feeling of safety, both for shop staff, owners and patrons alike. We've seen the installation of CCTV throughout Seaham, in the town centre and along the seafront. All that CCTV is actively monitored and can be linked to our force control room. And this has been coordinated by the local police team with our partners in DCC, but the funding and all the planning has come with local councillors and area action partnership funding. Similarly, using money from Safer Streets, we've got additional CCTV at local businesses in Easons and Colliery. Like the example cited earlier on from McDonald's, we're constantly horizon scanning and looking ahead to issues coming our way. So there's an awful lot of planning at the moment in relation to the Garden Village development between Seaham and Hawthorne, which is a 7-year development plan. Again, our local neighbourhood inspector there is doing pre-planning with our partners, and we've got funding to the tune of £70,000 for ANPR in this location, again raised by our local councillors and area action partnership funding. Next slide, please. Durham City, all areas within the constabulary, not just Durham City, but all areas that have a significant amount of shops in a concentrated area have a shop watch scheme to tackle and prevent retail crime and antisocial behaviour. This is done with effective communication and the prompt reporting of incidents and the sharing of intelligence via two-way radios that all our neighbourhood police teams have access to. Durham City has a particularly effective shop watch scheme, which meets on a regular basis with members of the local policing teams. And again, there's an ongoing forum to discuss issues, trends, and identify any work that we need to do to solve problems. Similarly, the operations managers of the bigger retail outlets, such as the Arneson Centre, Castledean or Dalton Park, regularly have interaction with our policing teams and support our teams, again, with the two-way radios, enabling us to respond quickly to any incidents or broadcast any messages and operations, but more, again, on the sort of problem-solving side. So every retailer has that same shared situational intelligence, shared situational awareness, and they can look after each other as well as the police being much more responsive. Similar to the shop watch schemes, there's also pub watch and garage watch initiatives throughout the county, which run on a very similar premise, that of sharing intelligence quickly and generally working together to prevent crime and disorder. Next slide, please. So another really positive example of our partnership approach to retailer crime is Up Cargo in Darlington. I won't go into the full details of this initiative now, as it is a presentation in itself, but one which I'd urge all colleagues to view in the annual Problem Solving Awards. But essentially, this was an initiative launched on the run up to Christmas, where we regularly see an uptick in shoplifting. So an initiative was launched in Darlington with the objective of reducing those numbers, increasing confidence in retailers and the police, and improving the intelligence and the communication flow. We did some analytical work which showed there were 3 stores in Darlington that were massively disproportionate in how many thefts they were subject to. And similarly, when we did sort of face-to-face engagements, there was also a significant number of underreported thefts or suspicious incidents. And whilst they were being shared amongst the retailers themselves, some of that intelligence wasn't shared with local policing, and consequently, we were unaware of some of our emerging offenders. So the local police team down there did a series of ongoing work with retailers in the town centre with the civic enforcement officers. An op cargo was formed. Very, very briefly, this comprised of dedicated neighbourhood resources being deployed to the town centres, targeting prolific offenders at hotspot times, as defined by our analysis. There was daily briefings given to CCTV operatives, to shop staff, to security staff, and to civic enforcement officers, where pictures of offenders and their vehicles were shared on a daily basis. There was a WhatsApp group formed where, again, images were shared instantly between stores to warn each other of suspicious activities, and further link radios were added from funding found from various partnership funding pots. And target hardening and prevention advice was given to all stores. Again, I can't give Op Cargo the full justice it deserves, but I would encourage you to look at it at the Problem Solving Awards. Essentially, this led to a 77% decline in shop thefts compared to December 2019. And for those of you who are asking why I use those figures, 2020 was an outlier given the pandemic lockdown. So I'm trying to compare a full Christmas season with a full Christmas season. We'll look to replicate this throughout the county as we on the run up to Christmas this year as well. Next slide, please. Darlington again, our approach to tackling retail crime and disorder isn't limited just to Christmas. So another example from Darlington was an acute spike in ASB around Asda and Yarm Road, where there was 43 reports between September 21 and March 22. Again, using a similar partnership approach with civic enforcement and engagements with the store, we were able to identify the ringleaders and separate them from peripheral youths who were causing nuisance. Again, our focus at this level of ASB is much more on education and prevention. So we did 79 acceptable behaviour agreements with parents or with guardians, and consequently between April and August of this year, there's only been 5 reports in what is usually our busiest time for reports of ASB. Next slide, please. Durham Dales, you'll have heard me talk about this before, but the Durham Dales really is a beacon of community problem solving, facilitated and encouraged by our local police teams. There is an army of volunteers who communicate daily on a really vibrant and active WhatsApp group, and Zello, forgive me for those that don't know, Zello is a 2-way radio app that you can have on your phone. So in the old days it was CB radios, it's now an app on your phone. And this shares intelligence of those offenders who target our rural communities. All that communication is supported by frequent and large-scale farm watch operations. Again, it's volunteer-led, but supported by our neighbourhood teams, and it's created a really, really hostile environment for would-be thieves. And the results are really, really encouraging. There's a 23% drop in insurance claims to the NFU. And when I speak to Kate from the NFU, they cite Durham in their annual report as an area of good practice. Again, further work is ongoing. We're not complacent in any of this. And Inspector Ed Turner is looking at the installation of new ANPR up in the Dales and some of the more rural areas. Next slide, please. Similar to other areas, both Newton Aycliffe and Bishop Auckland have shop watch schemes in place, and there are good links with local businesses, with the local neighbourhood teams. I don't propose to labour this slide too much, but you can see from the bullets there the activity around the other localities in the south area. I'll touch on SentrySys. Both the Chief Constable and the Deputy Police Crime Commissioner talked in their introduction, so apologies for those that do know what SentrySys is, but essentially it's a cloud-based software system that allows us to receive retail crime evidence packs from participating retailers who wish to report a crime or commence an investigation. What we've seen historically is often when police attend reports of shoplifting, it's inconvenient to the store, or there's often only one member of staff working, or the member of staff can't operate the CCTV, or the CCTV footage isn't available. This causes additional demand on policing, which we can ill afford, but similarly, it's often inconvenient for the shops themselves, and it creates delays in bringing offenders to justice. So for stores that sign up to SentrySys, they're given digital accounts free of charge, which allows them to submit evidence packs at a time that suits them. That can include MG11s, which is essentially a witness statement, business impact statements, any other information on subjects of interest, and similarly they can upload media, be it CCTV or still images required for a conviction. So from a police perspective, this saves time and resources and money by eliminating the need to physically go out to a crime, particularly when it's a repeated attendance. But from retailers, it's also much more agile. It gives retailers time and resources. Security and loss prevention staff aren't required to spend face-to-face time with police officers, and the software automatically creates the required documentation that the police need. So all of this aids speedy justice and benefits retailers as well as ourselves. The metrics, sorry, just go back if you don't mind. Thank you. The metrics that you can see in front of you, they're provided by Superintendent Kev Weir, who's the Force Strategic Lead. But what I would do is I'd encourage any retailer or business who's interested in SentrySys, who's watching this either live or subsequently on YouTube, please contact your local neighbourhood police team via the Force website on the hyperlink, and we'll have someone come out and we can assist and enrol you on SentrySys. Thank you. On the road to Christmas, there is a National Week of Action planned from 17th to 24th of October to help support businesses and reduce business crime. Personally, I don't like the phrase Week of Action as it implies weeks of inaction, which hopefully the presentation from Chris and I shows this isn't the case. But regardless, we'll be doing a concerted push with retailers, with the National Business Crime Centre and our partners in cyber and prevention to prevent advice to all our business crime partners. There'll be joint patrols, there'll be targeted intervention of offenders, there'll be a significant crime prevention push, and there'll be proactive work in providing advice around fraud prevention and cyber-enabled crimes. And similar to my last plea, any business watching this who wants to avail themselves of cybersecurity or target hardening, again, please contact us via the Force website, via either your local police teams or the Cyber Prevent Officer, Claire Turnbull, and we'll be all too willing to help. Next slide, please. Again, the Deputy Police Crime Commissioner talked about the importance of tackling violence against retail workers. It is a really serious issue, and elsewhere in the country we've seen the very well documented incidents of violence against retail workers, particularly in the southeast and those working in fashion outlets. It is something we should take seriously, and we do take seriously in the constabulary using our Thrive approach. But I'm happy to report there is a very low prevalence of violence against retail workers in the Durham Force area. And from what I can gather, there is no emergent trend in our force area of violence against retail workers. Our ongoing partnership supports early reporting should an incident occur. And I'm also cognizant that the Shop Kind campaign, which is an initiative by retailers, the big national retailers, is also being rolled out locally. But I think that's as part of a national push as opposed to there being a local issue. And I think this narrative that I'm giving you now is supported by data taken from the National Business Crime Stats on the next slide. So again, we can see there is a very low prevalence in the Northeast. But again, we are not complacent in this. We're fully briefed on the legislation and the impact that violence can have, and we will be robust and relentless in bringing offenders to justice should an incident of violence occur. But at the time of us talking now, it doesn't seem to be a particularly acute problem. I think that concludes our presentation, which I hope has given an insight into the activity and the varied bespoke responses the constabulary offer. Thanks for listening, and we'd invite any questions.
Thank you very much, Neil and Chris, for that very comprehensive overview, which no doubt proves that you are taking action all year round and not just in a week in October. Before I continue, I'd just like to invite Jo, the Chief Constable, the opportunity to make any additional points if she wants.
Thank you. I think the presentation there gave a really broad and explanation in relation to how seriously we take this type of crime, and has given anybody watching this both the sort of two sides, I suppose, in terms of the way it was presented. So the quality and the depth and breadth of our investigations, and how some of the activity requires cross-border cooperation between different forces. So we don't just stop at the border of County Durham. And then also Neil's description there around both the partnership working and the focus around problem solving and prevention. So we're getting ahead of these issues, both very, very early on, at the example in terms of the planning around McDonald's, but also looking at issues around antisocial behaviour and how we ensure that people remain safe and able to go about their business. And as I said at the beginning, you know, that we continue to be economically viable, given how challenging the environment that everybody's living and working in currently. Thank you.
Thank you. I would certainly endorse that. And I think one of the things that struck me was also responding to things that change quite quickly. So the situation in Ukraine giving rise to cooking oil being used as a biofuel, and then dealing with the criminalities means that in addition to what you're dealing with, if one can say it on a day-to-day basis, there are trends, there are things that happen that then we have to respond to. And I think that was one of the ones that mean that Durham is responding to things old and new in terms of business crime. So with that, and I thank Chris and Neil again for that presentation. We've had some questions, and what I'd like to do is just pick up some of these. They are one of them is touching on information you've already given, but it would just look to get some more detail. So if I can start off, what work are the force doing to encourage retailers to report shoplifting offences and sign up to Sentry SIS?
Good morning, Nigel. It's Kieran Irving here. I'm going to give Neil and Chris's voices a little bit of a rest and pick up the answers to, or the initial answers certainly, to the core questions. And Chris, Neil, and indeed the Chief may choose to chip in with some additional pieces, but I'm conscious that they might run out of words. So in answer to your first question, I think Neil has pointed out that, you know, the neighbourhood teams in particular have significant contact with the larger retail outlets, the bigger businesses, the likes of the Marks and Spencers, the Tesco's, the Asda's and similar, working across the whole area. And then at a more granular level, those neighbourhood officers and PCSOs routinely are engaging conversations with our smaller retailers to support and encourage reporting of anything and everything, so we've got the best information and intelligence, whether it be in relation to crime or ASB, and then we can put the right responses in place. I think specifically in relation to Sentry SIS, we're one of the lead forces across the country, and Superintendent Weir, who's been mentioned already, has got very strong links with Sentry SIS as a company, both in terms of promoting it within the constabulary area and beyond for that matter, but also in terms of helping Sentry SIS develop their offer so it's more consistent and appropriate for retailers and the different types of crime that they contend with. That leadership model is done centrally with Sentry SIS, and then we push it out as a cascade through our neighbourhood teams and our other operational teams to basically take any and every opportunity when they go into retail premises to encourage the owner or the manager to sign up, and then we provide sort of all the facilitation that we can to help them come on board. And of course, you've seen from the main presentation the the operational and financial spin-offs that come to the force in relation to having people engage with Sentry System reporting and supporting investigations through that tool. And we keep a close eye on that, a lot like the work that we do in relation to In the Know between ourselves and the PCC's office, to encourage further sign-ups and monitor who's coming on board, and then we can pick up any gaps and try and push in those areas as best we can.
Thank you very much. And we have been looking at a little bit of an uplift, so that certainly from the office point of view, we would look to help and continue promote that. The second question I have is one which is pretty current. Under the current climate of the cost of living crisis, it is feared that shoplifting offences are going to increase. What measures are being put in place to protect people from this? I know Chris has touched on it. It's just to see what more detail there might be.
Well, I think it's an unfortunate reality, isn't it, that the sort of global issues that are happening now have affected the UK quite significantly, whether it be in relation to the increased prices for fuel, both vehicles, vehicle fuel, and at home, and then the availability of certain things that we would have taken for granted, right the way from the ability to purchase a car or take holidays, obtain even certain foodstuffs is becoming very difficult. And I think from a professional perspective, in policing, we would see that not just an increase in acquisitive crime, but we may see increases in crime in other areas such as domestic abuse as pressure comes on to families, people losing their jobs and such like. So we have measures already in place to help us understand as we see the increases in that, but specifically in relation to shoplifting, we're alive to the changing dynamic of that kind of theft in the local areas. Neil's already described the work that we'll do in relation to op cargo, and those plans that we'll have in place up to that busy Christmas period, and there'll be that combination around crime prevention in the local areas and also the targeting of our prolific offenders, both by uniform and detective officers. Because we've talked not only about shoplifting there, we've talked about that wider business crime and the impact, particularly in our rural areas, of people moving out and committing crime where they might not necessarily be in the sight of police at a routine level. It's important, I think, and Neil's already done this, to acknowledge the support that we get, not only from partners in the commercial sector, partners within local authority, but also the broader community, and particularly, as Neil's mentioned, the work that goes on out in the Dales, using all manner of systems to keep the thin blue line that is policing present in local communities and helping to reduce crime and reduce its impact. Certainly from our perspective, not only in terms of the work we do around enforcement, but also the sort of market leading stuff that we do in relation to diversion, out of court activity, and work that we do to support people who offend because of social and or other sort of criminal drivers. We will make use of the DART schemes, we'll make use of Checkpoint, we'll make sure that we can provide supportive pathways to people who are committing crime as a result of their, broader circumstances as opposed to necessarily, chosen criminal intent. And we do a lot of work with charities by extrapolation around that, to ensure that if we do find people who are committing crime, and particularly, if we're talking about shoplifting, we'll look to ensure that we can push them away from that repeated revolving door, because inevitably there will be some people who are committing crime out of need to feed the children, and particularly we might see that with the female group of offenders, as we have seen in the past, when it's not only sort of drugs but also the need to provide food for children that we see, and we look to treat that kind of criminality sensitively, whilst at the same time coming down hard on those organised criminals that we've talked about as part of the main briefing.
Yep, thank you for that. And just as you touched on drugs, that leads me to the third question. And the final one I have is, how big an impact does drug addiction have on offences of theft and shoplifting? And what steps are being taken to deal with people continually doing this?
I think I think particularly when we talk about Class A drug use, and in particular heroin and maybe to an extent crack cocaine, the desire and need for people to fund that habit is all consuming, and one of the easiest kinds of offences to commit is theft from shop. It can be a fairly quick hit. You're unlikely to get jail time as a consequence of that kind of offending, and quite often the commodities that are stolen, and historically we talk about the things like razor blades and coffee. We talk about other items which can be moved on very quickly, probably through licensed premises. And Neil's touched on some of the unlawful organised criminal activity that comes in and around licensed premises. But we've to remember that as well as the people running those premises, there are also people using them to further criminal aims as in the guise of customers. So there's a lot of work that gets done in and around that to try and prevent the outlet. But I think more importantly, to talk about the offender side of things, we've got we adhere to all the national best practice in relation to offender management. We're currently beginning a review to make sure that we were not only fit for purpose now, but also fit for the future. We work closely with probation colleagues and those with drug rehabilitation schemes in order to try and support addicts who are stealing to feed addictions, and really focusing on trying to get them away from drugs and away from the not just the crime, but also the locality that they're in, which might push them down a particular path. We support through the DAC, the Free Project, which is particularly aimed at female offenders who are seeking to get away from a life of crime. And ideally, what we want to see is if we can cut the cause through reducing people's addictions, then potentially they won't necessarily be forced down a criminal path. We use those schemes by means of not only partner referral, but also prison releases, and then referrals that we might put in place when we come about people in case of acute need when they're committing offences. And I think it's important to not only just think about drugs, but we see this in the context of broader needs. So very often people who turn to drugs might have underlying mental health issues, maybe seeking to escape depressive illness as a consequence of reduction in finance, breakdown in relationship. And also we've got to remember that a lot of people who are in this sort of place are from the lower socioeconomic groups, so poor housing, poor education, ill health that sits around that, very few prospects. So I think the work that we do across our neighbourhood teams, and I know Neil's talked about the East, and we talk about the work that gets done in and around sort of Seam and Easington there with the neighbourhood team is really high quality. The multi-agency work in relation to the Horden project, all of these things come into play, which we hope will help reduce prevalence of offending around that. And I say, whilst drugs is an important driver, there are other pieces there in the jigsaw, and drugs tends to be another piece in that same jigsaw.
Thanks for that, Kieran, and I'll perhaps underline that from the office as well, is that in terms of the figures that were given before, Durham Constabulary has a good record in terms of prosecuting people, despite the fact that there are quite a lot of issues that don't get resolved, but they're in terms of the national picture, we're doing very well. I think the second thing, and is just what you've said, is that there's a lot of effort being put in by both Durham Constabulary and the office about trying to prevent people getting onto the path of criminality. And again, there are some successes in there that hopefully today has highlighted to people that this work is ongoing and has been successful. So I think that in terms of today, again, thank you for that, those answers, Kieran. This really brings me to the end of the accountability meeting, and I do hope the presentation and the questions have been useful for those watching, because these public accountability meetings give a chance to see the work that's going on within Durham Constabulary that quite often doesn't make the headlines, and quite often it doesn't get into the public view. So we see this as an opportunity to see that work, and also from the office point of view, so that we can hold the force accountable for the work that it's doing. As I conclude, and I realise I've got some spare time, so I'm never going to miss the opportunity, what I want to do is just emphasise some key points. On the 28th of June this year, a new statutory aggravating factor was introduced via Section 156 of the Police Crime and Sentencing Courts Act. This new provision makes attacking an individual who serves the public, including shop workers, an aggravated offence. The officers welcomed this. The provision does not change the current maximum penalty for the offences covered. However, aggravating factors are considered by the court when making sentencing decisions, and the court can consider a tougher sentence with the maximum penalty. COVID has had an impact in this space, with violence linked to COVID security enforcement in premises reported as the top trigger for offences. And hopefully, as the restrictions are coming down, we'll see less of that in the future. Shoplifting and the challenge of suspected shoplifters is seen as an increasing factor in violence against retailers' workers. Anecdotally, this is linked to cost of living increases, change in attitudes linked to perception of victimless crime. It's to some people it doesn't harm because your only crime is against the business. Well, business have people too, and it costs them. And perceived and real reduced police resources to deal and respond. Other factors for violence triggers include enforcing age restriction sales and refusal to serve intoxicated customers. This highlights the impact of alcohol as a driver for such offences. Verbal abuse and threats of violence remain the most prevalent violent type experienced. Violence is seen as the #1 threat faced by retail workers, although we have seen in the presentation that from Durham Constabulary's point of view, we tend to have lower incidents in comparison to many other areas. Smaller businesses are not equipped to deal with violence and wider crime due to a lack of resources, security provision to deter and deal, or ability to absorb the cost from theft offences. And we particularly looking at ways that might be able to help the smaller businesses. Messaging around shoplifting as a lower priority or a victimless crime may lead to increases in theft and offences and in turn more violence. And we hope today that have highlighted that this is not a victimless offence and can cause serious disruption to those businesses involved. Employers are encouraged to ensure that they have procedures in place to raise awareness with employees of the new aggravating factors, understand procedures for reporting incidents, gather and record relevant evidence, and work closely with the police. Also, retailers and their staff are encouraged to provide a victim personal statement where they've been a victim of the crime. Under the Victims Code, all businesses or enterprises that have had a criminal offence committed against them are entitled to make a business impact statement. Information provided in business impact assessments will assist courts in considering the impact of the offences and the appropriate sentences. So as I draw the meeting to a conclusion, I also would like to take the opportunity to publicise the much talked about £200 limit of theft of goods to the value of is not true, and to report all incidents, no matter how small, and explain the reasons businesses need to do this. Lastly, I want to assure the public that the police force take retail worker abuse incidents seriously and will ensure that they are investigated in full. And I hope that the session today has provided the information that shows how Durham Constabulary takes seriously this issue, and that the Police and Crime Commissioner is monitoring the situation and has outlined in the Safer Business section of her Police and Crime report Police and Crime Plan, that this issue is being taken seriously. So finally, I would like to thank the Chief Constable, Neil, Chris and Kieran, and the rest of your team for supporting this event today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well,